This is not a lecture about whether you should remarry. It is not even a discussion about companionship in later life. What we are examining today is far more fundamental. How human beings confront fear, loss, and dignity at the final stage of life, and how those forces quietly shape the relationships they choose. After the age of 60, love is no longer what it once was. It is no longer a story about possibility, expansion, or romantic discovery. Instead, it becomes something far more serious, almost architectural. It becomes a question of design. Not the design of a moment, but the design of the final structure of one's life. By this stage, no one enters a relationship untouched. There have already been endings, losses that cannot be undone, a spouse who is gone, a marriage that collapsed, children whose lives are now entangled with your own decisions, a body that no longer guarantees time, a future that feels shorter than the past. So when someone in their 60s considers remarriage or cohabitation, they are not simply asking, "Can I love again?" They are asking something much deeper. How do I live with the fear of losing everything again? This is why late life relationships are often misunderstood. On the surface, they appear to be about companionship, but beneath that surface, they are structured around something else entirely: the management of existential anxiety. Now, who is this conversation for? It is for three groups. First, for women in later life, who may find that loneliness quietly distorts judgment. Loneliness is not just an emotion, it is a force. It narrows perception. It accelerates decisions. It makes temporary comfort feel like permanent truth. Second, for men who believe they are acting rationally, while in reality, they are designing relationships around unacknowledged fear. And third, for the adult children who stand at the edge of these decisions, watching their parents enter relationships they may not fully understand. But today I want to speak with particular clarity to women over 60, because in this stage of life the risks are often asymmetrical, and dignity once compromised is difficult to recover. So the question becomes, what must you be cautious of, and what must you insist upon? Let us begin with caution. The first illusion to resist is the language of fairness. Fairness sounds virtuous. It sounds rational. It sounds modern. But when fairness becomes the starting point of a relationship, what you are entering is no longer a relationship. It is a contract. A contract measures. A contract calculates. A contract protects against loss, but it does not create emotional safety. The second illusion is the phrase, "We each live our own life." To Western ears, this sounds mature, independent, healthy, but taken too far, it becomes something else. A structure of mutual disengagement. A relationship where emotional and financial separation is emphasized to such a degree that responsibility quietly disappears. It is not freedom. It is avoidance. The third warning is this: be cautious of individuals who repeatedly emphasize principles. Principles are beautiful in theory, but when principles are rigid, when they leave no room for context, vulnerability, or change, they cease to be moral. They become instruments of control. And finally, in the early stages of a relationship, do not focus on promises. Focus on structure under pressure. Ask yourself, when circumstances become unfavorable, does this person adapt, or does the structure remain fixed? Because a person who cannot adjust the structure of a relationship is not protecting the relationship. They are protecting themselves. Now let us turn to what must be practiced. First, trust your internal signal, not your logic, not your fear, but your felt experience. Ask yourself, can I breathe in this relationship? Can I speak without calculation? Am I respected not for what I contribute, but for who I am? Second, do not avoid difficult conversations in the beginning. Money, health, children. These are not threats to love. They are the conditions under which love must survive. In later life, transparency is not optional. It is structural. Third, do not rush. Loneliness intensifies at night, and decisions made in emotional darkness often feel convincing. But night is not a reliable architect of lifelong commitments. Fourth, take seriously how a person has responded to loss. Because loss does not simply wound people, it reconfigures them. Some become deeper, more open, more capable of love. Others become tighter, more controlling, more defensive. And this distinction will define everything. There is an ancient text that describes a state between death and rebirth, a psychological space of illusion shaped by attachment and fear. In that framework, what matters is not the external world, but the internal projections that distort it. Now consider this. Late life relationships often resemble this in-between state, not because of death, but because of fear of loss. We are not always seeking love. We are often trying to prevent loss from happening again. We are not choosing a partner. We are attempting to regulate anxiety. And here is the paradox. The more we try to control the relationship, through fairness, through calculation, through rigid structure, the more we strip it of the very conditions that allow it to endure. It may feel safer, but it becomes existentially thin, because love, especially in later life, is not sustained by precision. It is sustained by something far more difficult, the courage to tolerate uncertainty. Now let us consider an alternative structure, a relationship in which one partner, traditionally the man, assumes most or all of the financial responsibility. To a modern observer, this may appear unbalanced, even regressive, but structurally, it operates under a different premise. It does not begin with calculation. It begins with commitment to a shared existence. And this changes the fundamental question within the relationship. Not who paid more, but how do we endure this together? In such a structure, conflict does not immediately trigger evaluation or exit, because the relationship has already been framed as something, not easily dissolved. Now, this does not mean it is ideal or morally superior, but it does mean something important. It is harder to leave. And paradoxically, what is harder to leave is often more likely to be preserved. From a philosophical perspective, this reflects a deeper truth. Stability in human relationships is not created by perfect fairness. It is created by accepted entanglement, by choosing a bond that includes risk, loss, imbalance, and still remaining. So we arrive at the central distinction. There are relationships designed for exit and relationships designed for endurance. The modern trend increasingly favors the former. We speak the language of risk management, asset protection, fair distribution, exit strategy, all of which sound intelligent, responsible, even necessary. But hidden beneath this language is an assumption that relationships are fundamentally potential losses to be minimized. Love becomes an investment. Cohabitation becomes a contract. Remarriage becomes a negotiation. And here is the cost. You reduce the possibility of pain, but you also reduce the possibility of depth, because relationships by their nature are built on uncertainty. There is no complete safety. There is no perfect fairness. And the moment calculation becomes the foundation, the relationship becomes something you can always walk away from, easily, cleanly, without emotional residue. That may protect you, but it will not transform you. So what is required, especially of men in later life, is not a more refined system of control. It is something far more difficult. The willingness to admit fear, to say, I am afraid of losing again. And so I tried to build a structure where I wouldn't. But in doing so, I made intimacy impossible. And for women, the standard is equally clear. Not promises, not financial terms, but experience. Am I alive in this relationship? Am I free in my expression? Am I valued as a person, not as a condition? Because in the end, the most dangerous shift is not individual behavior. It is cultural direction. When relationships become systems of risk control, we do not eliminate suffering. We eliminate meaning. And so the final insight is simple but difficult to accept. The more tightly you try to hold on to fairness, the more quietly emotional safety disappears. Love, especially in later life, does not deepen through control. It deepens through the courage to remain open in the presence of uncertainty. If this perspective resonates with you, then this is not just a conversation. It is an invitation to think more carefully, to choose more consciously, and perhaps to live the final chapter of life with a little more courage than fear. So we now arrive at a critical threshold. If, as we established earlier, some relationships in later life are quietly structured around fear rather than connection, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What do these structures actually look like in real conversations? How do they reveal themselves, not in theory, but in language, in tone, in small decisions? Because relationships do not collapse suddenly. They reveal their architecture early if you know how to listen. Consider this pattern. When responsibility is discussed, it is often framed not as care, but as payment. Responsibility becomes something that must be quantified, justified, and reciprocated. In this structure, to give is not to love. It is to invest. An investment, by definition, expects return. So when you ask, what happens if your partner cannot contribute financially? The answer is often immediate and revealing. Then we need to reconsider the relationship. What does this mean? It means that money has become a proxy for loyalty. Commitment is no longer measured in presence, care, or endurance, but in contribution. When decision-making is discussed, the pattern continues. Major decisions I will handle. Smaller ones we can discuss. On the surface, this sounds efficient, even reasonable, but structurally it creates asymmetry. Authority is centralized. Participation is conditional. And equality becomes rhetorical, not real. And when disagreement arises, we should follow the rational option. But here is the subtle shift. Rationality is not treated as a shared process. It is treated as a personal conclusion. In other words, what is rational quietly becomes what I have already decided. Now observe what happens when emotional discomfort enters the conversation. If your partner feels this is unfair, that's just emotional thinking. In that moment, something critical occurs. The other person's internal reality is not engaged. It is invalidated. Emotion is downgraded. Experience is dismissed. And the relationship loses one of its essential dimensions, recognition. Then comes the language of rules. Rules are important so things don't fall apart. And this is where we must be precise. Rules are not inherently harmful, but when rules are used not to guide, but to stabilize anxiety, they become something else entirely. They become defensive structures, not to support the relationship, but to protect the self from uncertainty. Even the distinction between love and control becomes blurred. It's not control, it's management. Notice the language. Control is softened, rebranded, made acceptable, but the function remains the same. To reduce unpredictability, to eliminate risk, to ensure that nothing escapes one's influence. And finally, the ultimate test. What if your partner decides to leave? The answer, then there's nothing to be done. Principles must be maintained. This is perhaps the most revealing moment of all, because here the hierarchy is exposed. Not the relationship first, not the person first, but the structure first. The system must survive, even if the relationship does not. So let us step back and name what we are seeing. There are three recurring relational architectures. First, the conditional fairness model, which speaks the language of equality but lacks empathy. Second, the emotional and financial separation model, which speaks the language of independence but avoids responsibility. Third, the control recovery model, which speaks the language of rationality but operates through asymmetrical power. And across all three, there is a single unifying warning signal. When circumstances become unfavorable, does the structure adapt or remain rigid? If it does not change, then the relationship was never designed for mutual survival. It was designed for self-protection. Now we must move beyond observation and ask a more difficult question. How long do such structures actually last? Here we encounter an important limitation. There is no precise statistical model that maps psychological types to relationship duration across cultures. Human interiority is not easily quantified. However, broader demographic patterns offer us a structural lens. In the United States, second marriages last, on average, around 8 years. In Japan, many marriages extend between 10 and 15 years, with some lasting longer. In South Korea, the average duration tends to fall within a similar range, approximately 7 to 10 years. Different cultures, different histories, and yet a striking convergence. Between 7 and 15 years, many remarriages and cohabiting relationships reach a point of fracture. So the question is no longer statistical, it is philosophical. Why? Why do these relationships, especially after 60, struggle to endure? The answer lies not in compatibility, but in structure of consciousness. The conditional fairness model operates on psychological accounting. I did this, so you must do that. Every act becomes a unit. Every gesture becomes measurable. Every imbalance becomes a future conflict. And when conflict arises, the past is summoned like evidence. At that moment, the relationship transforms from a lived experience into a negotiated ledger. Over time, this produces emotional exhaustion, not because conflict exists, but because nothing is ever allowed to remain unmeasured. The separation model appears peaceful. No interference, no entanglement, no conflict. But this peace comes at a cost, because what is removed along with conflict is depth. Without emotional investment, a relationship cannot evolve beyond function. It becomes companionship without transformation, presence without meaning, and eventually, one or both individuals begin to ask, "Why am I here?" The control recovery model is perhaps the most psychologically charged. It emerges from prior loss of authority, respect, or agency. So the new relationship becomes a site of restoration. But here lies the danger. When a relationship becomes a tool for psychological repair, the other person is no longer an equal subject. They become a mechanism. And when control is threatened, the reaction is not disagreement. It is existential alarm. At this point, we must introduce a deeper philosophical lens. There is an ancient idea that describes a state in which human perception is shaped not by reality, but by attachment, fear, and projection. A state in which we do not see what is, but what we are trying to hold on to. In relationships, this state appears constantly. The illusion of being right, the illusion of being safe, the illusion of finally being in control. But these are not stable foundations. They are psychological constructions. And when mistaken for reality, they create cycles of suffering. So perhaps the most uncomfortable truth is this. Late life relationships do not fail simply because of the other person. They fail because of what we refuse to release. We are not always trying to love. We are trying to avoid loss. We are not seeking connection. We are seeking compensation for the past. And when a relationship becomes an extension of the past, it loses its capacity to exist in the present. This is why so many relationships begin to fracture within that 7-15-year window. Not because time destroys them, but because unresolved attachment patterns recreate the same ending. So what then is required? Not more precise calculation, not stricter boundaries, not more sophisticated control, but 3 difficult shifts. From calculation to commitment, from separation to trust, from control to letting go. Because ultimately, a relationship is not a contract to be optimized. It is a practice, a discipline of being with another human being without turning them into a solution. And this brings us forward. If relationships after 60 are largely shaped by how we manage anxiety, then what about relationships in our 40s? Because there the problem is not the same. It is not primarily about loss management. It is about life reconstruction. A woman in her 40s does not approach remarriage from the same psychological position. She is not simply seeking stability. She is reorganizing identity, safety, dignity, and future. And when that structure meets a partner driven by control or fear, a very different kind of tension emerges. That is where we will go next. In the following lecture, we will examine why women in their 40s, despite experience and maturity, often repeat the same relational errors, and how those errors are rooted not in ignorance, but in miscalibrated perception. If today's discussion has offered you a clearer lens, then it has already done its work, because understanding structure is the first step toward changing it. If you would like to continue this inquiry, to go deeper into how relationships evolve across different stages of life, then I invite you to stay with this series. Subscribe, share, and continue the exploration. Because sometimes a single shift in perspective can prevent years of unnecessary suffering. I will see you in the next lecture.